How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, there seems to be in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case, the David case, d4vd, some confusion related to the warrant. More importantly, the receipt of what was taken. And I saw SF investigates when he was on Law and Crime that he was saying, yeah, the homeowner wasn't even given a receipt. Well, he's not entitled to one. He's the homeowner. He's not the person who leased the property. So we don't know what happened with that receipt. It could have went to Josh Marshall, the person that rented the property, or they said there was nobody home when they did the forced entry, but we don't know if that receipt was provided to someone in that entourage, because that is part of the due process. But let's not cause confusion. The landlord is not entitled to one. So all because he doesn't have one doesn't mean LAPD messed up. They're not entitled. The landlord is not entitled to a receipt. I did my checks today. I did my little investigations, talked to some people that have served a lot of warrants on the official side. So when LAPD arrived at the rental property connected to the Celeste Rivas Hernandez investigation, they came with a search warrant in hand. They entered, they searched, and they seized items. But this is where the confusion comes in. The homeowner, the person who actually owns that house, being told he didn't get a receipt, they didn't get a call. They didn't even get a courtesy heads up. And you want to know why? Because they're not entitled to any of it. Because ownership of the property doesn't matter here. What matters is who was living there, who had control. Control, which when you fill out a lease, control from the person renting the property, they lose a lot of that. Who had the keys and the right to lock the door and tell people to stay out would be the people that signed that lease and took that level of control from the owner. So these are people on David's team, most likely, as I said, Josh Marshall, and they're the tenants technically. And under the law, that means they held something more important than a deed. They held the reasonable expectation of privacy. Guys, if you guys rent a house, the landlord can't just come in when they want. And the reason why the landlord did not get a call about a warrant possibly being served, or a warrant that's going to be served, or whatever it is, or here's a receipt, is because you're not entitled to it. So they're not going to call you. The only person that would probably be receiving calls at this time is someone connected to that lease, Josh Marshall or someone from the team. So the Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches. It doesn't protect property. It protects privacy. And when you rent a home, your privacy rights travel with you into that space, even though you don't own it. The landlord can't just walk in whenever they want. They can't consent to a police search of your home, and they can't demand to see the paperwork when law enforcement executes a warrant on your rental. I was LAPD and said before I could get a warrant, hey, I would like to search the rented property that you have leased out to these tenants. The landlord can't give permission for that search. He rented it out. He signed over that. You know, if you wanted to do that before a warrant, you got to get the permission from whoever leased it out. So that's why the landlord's not getting a call. There's a federal rule of criminal procedure 41, and it states state level equivalence spells this out. When officers execute a search warrant, they have to leave a copy of the warrant and an inventory of what they took. But that documentation doesn't go to the property owner. It goes to the person whose space was searched, the occupant or the tenant. So, I mean, even if they didn't leave it on the property, they could have had some exchange with Josh Marshall or someone. It could have been through email. It could have been a hard copy where it could be delivered to, because it is a due process concern. It is a due process concern. So maybe when they went into the house or the house later on with the private investigator and was looking for the receipt it doesn't go to you. It could have been already delivered to the people that it goes to, which is the tenant, which is basically the person that has more ownership of the property that was in there. If someone's home, when the search happened, officers hand them the document directly, and they're kind of saying that nobody was home. It was a forced entry. So if no one's there, they could leave the paperwork inside the residence, or find a way to connect with the person who leased it in this case, because it was rented. But either way, the landlord is left out of the loop, and not out of rudeness or oversight, but because legally they're not the relevant party. The tenant is. So in the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case, the entire rental property was tied to Josh Marshall and to some extent the d4vd team. They were the tenants. That's the key. They were living there. They had a lease. They controlled access to the home. So when LAPD showed up with a warrant, they were searching technically Josh Marshall's space, but really d4vd and his team, even though d4vd's name wasn't on it, I guess you could say definitely it's leased to Josh Marshall, so his living space, and then the people that he put as possible tenants. And it's not the homeowner. That means the warrant and the receipt, that inventory of seized items, would have been left for Josh Marshall and the team. If they were there, it was handed to them. If they weren't, could have been left inside the house, or as I mentioned, it could have been somehow given to him at a later date, because it is part of the due process. But either way, the landlord didn't get a copy. They weren't entitled to one. They might own the walls and the roof, but they didn't own the privacy interest inside those walls. That belongs to the tenant. And here's the thing. Even if the landlord wanted to know what happened, even if they had legitimate concerns about their property or their lease agreement, law enforcement has no obligation to fill them in. Not during an active investigation, not when the case is still open. So yes, the landlord is trying to find out, because I'm learning the process too. I did videos not too long ago that try to understand that perspective, but now I'm seeing things differently. And basically here, you get an investigator and, well, they're not even calling me, so I had to get an investigator. They don't have to call you. It's an active investigation. So I want to make sure that people don't think that LAPD's messing up. They're trying to protect the integrity of the investigation, because the way it's coming out, or in my opinion, it's coming out is like they're incompetent, they're not doing their job. And no, they're protecting the integrity of the investigation. If someone finds something and they give it to them, okay, we'll take it. And if they want to know more, you're not in the privy to know more. And I honestly think they know what happened. They know a lot more. And when they did their searches, it was targeted because, remember, d4vd was cooperative. He came out and technically he was a witness at first. We don't know where he's at now because there's other charges that should possibly come his way when they discover what the root of that real relationship is between him and Celeste. But in the meantime, he came up as cooperative. What does that mean? That means he's leading him in a direction. So how do we know that when they went to serve the warrant, they knew what to get? Oh, they left all this stuff behind, relevant to what your perspective is. But it may not be relevant to what they have evidence on to verify the information that's being provided. So I just don't want people to think that they're being incompetent. It's honestly, they probably have enough information to know where this story is headed. And when someone comes in and says, hey, this is information I'm giving you, and they're expecting something in return, LAPD is like, yeah, not going to happen. Give us what you want. You may think it's relevant, but you don't know what we know. And we'll release it, eventually when the autopsy comes out. I'm sure we'll let you guys know a little bit more. But right now, people are taking advantage of this ambiguity of time to either create a narrative or become the centralized focus of the investigation. Centralized involvement in this investigation, not focus. Well, focus if you're stealing media time, because right now it doesn't matter what he says or what matters is what the confirmed authority says. So yeah, maybe focus was the right word because you want to be the focus of it. And again, I'm not trying to attack, but I just want to make sure that we're objective in how we view this, because it was just put on there that there's a belief that, wow, the owner should have gotten a copy of that. No. And I asked around and I'm pretty confident with my answer. This is a homicide investigation. It's ongoing. LAPD is not going to release evidence logs, warrant inventories, or investigative documents to anyone outside the case unless they're legally required to. That means the homeowner, despite owning the property, has no access to those materials. Not now, maybe not ever. It depends on how things unfold. There are narrow circumstances where the public can access warrant materials. Sometimes they surface during discovery if charges are filed. Sometimes they become part of the court record. Sometimes journalists file public record requests and get partial information after a case closes. But during an active investigation, those documents are sealed tight. The landlord might hear about the search through neighbors, through the media, through damage to their property, but they won't hear about it from LAPD, and they won't get a copy of that receipt unless it eventually becomes public through court proceedings. So right now we have an investigator who's creating his own kind of little narrative where he's in the central piece of that involvement, where technically You know, you don't know what LAPD knows. You don't know if they actually have what they need. And right now, everything is just a controlled effort, kind of going through the motions, more of to weed things out to further where the concern may be. Because sometimes they do that too. It's not just about investigating what they need to fit the evidence, but they also have to do deduction. So they may not be as active with those searches, but still relevant to some extent. So when the landlord hires a private investigator, now here's where things can get complicated and potentially problematic. I talked to a few prosecutors, even saw an interview recently with News Nation, how it does complicate the case. It does. It muddies the water. So let's say the landlord, frustrated by the lack of information and worried about their property, decides to hire a private investigator. Maybe they want to know what happened. Maybe they're concerned about liability. Maybe they're trying to figure out if they have grounds to terminate the lease or pursue damages. On the surface, it seems like a reasonable step for a property owner trying to protect their interests. And I saw that too. On one of my older videos, I said, hey, that's a smart move from the owner. But then as I further educated myself, and I did an episode with Russ, a friend of mine, we broke it down. I started seeing things differently right during the show. And I allowed this feeling of conflict to come through. And I'm like, wait, something doesn't feel right. And now I can't shake the feeling. And the conflict comes for me, anything that could mess with the justice for Celeste that we need. If I feel something, I have to act on it. It's just who I am. I'm sure who most of you guys are. So, but in the context of an active homicide investigation, decisions can create serious issues. So again, on the surface, it seems like a reasonable step for a property owner trying to protect their interests. But in the context of an active homicide investigation, this decision can create serious issues. First, there's the obstruction risk. Private investigators don't have the same constraints as law enforcement, but they also don't have the same protections or authority. If a PI starts nosing around an active crime scene, interviewing witnesses, or attempting to access investigative material, they can interfere with the official investigation. LAPD isn't going to appreciate a private party muddying the waters, and depending on what the PI does, it could cross the line to obstruction of justice. Because even if it was just about the home, he's doing a lot of stuff that really have nothing to do with that property. Come on, guys, let's be honest. He's doing stuff right now that really have nothing to do with that property. And by the way, if there was something that was shared on the property that wasn't just used by that tenant, then maybe you can talk to the landlord, but this wasn't the case here. So even if the PI is careful and stays within legal bounds, their mere presence can be disruptive. Witnesses might become confused about who they're talking to, and we're going through that confusion now. Evidence change could be questioned. Evidence chains could be questioned as to due process. And defense attorneys might later argue that the integrity of the investigation was compromised by outside interference. None of this helps anyone, not the landlord, not law enforcement, and certainly not the pursuit of justice in a homicide case. So our search for answers really should not do anything to jeopardize maybe the weight that we need for justice to come to Celeste. Second, there's a legal standing problem. The landlord doesn't have a right to the investigative file. They don't have standing to demand information from LAPD. So when they hire a PI to try to get that information, they're essentially trying to do an end run around legal restrictions that are in place for good reason. The PI can't compel LAPD to turn over documents. They can't access sealed records, and they can't force witnesses to talk if those witnesses are part of an ongoing investigation. What they can do is ask questions, knock on doors, and try to piece together information from publicly available sources or willing participants. But the moment they start pressing people who are involved in the case, whether that's witnesses, potential suspects, or even the tenant themselves, they risk creating problems that reverberate through the entire investigation. Remember, there was a point when he said that, yeah, and the owner is still talking to the manager. I mean, there's a lot of conflict there. You're talking to the manager as you're collecting evidence. I mean, what are we doing? Third, there's the tenant privacy. Remember, the tenants hold the legal privacy interest in that property. If the landlord sends a PI to dig into what happened at that rental, and that investigation involves surveilling the property, interviewing neighbors about the tenant's activities, or attempting to access information about what was seized during the search, the landlord might be violating the tenant's rights. Even though the landlord owns the property, they can't use that ownership to intrude on the tenant's privacy during the lease term. So I know they did break the lease, and that opens up a lot. But when the warrant was served, the lease was still in play. Hiring a PI to investigate the tenant's involvement in a criminal matter, or even just to investigate what happened at the property, walks a very fine line. Depending on how it's done, it could expose the landlord to civil liability for invasion of privacy, harassment, or breach of the lease and that implied covenant of quiet enjoyment. Fourth, there's the evidentiary contamination concern. This is my biggest concern. If the PI uncovers information, talks to witnesses, or interacts with physical evidence in any way, that could taint the integrity of the official investigation. Defense attorneys are always looking for ways to challenge the prosecution's case, and the involvement of a private investigator working for a landlord with no legal stake in the criminal case could provide ammunition for those challenges. Imagine this scenario. The PI interviews a witness who later testifies at trial. The defense argues that the witness' memory was influenced or contaminated by the PI's questioning, or the PI takes photographs of the property that differ from law enforcement's documentation, and the defense uses that to suggest evidence was mishandled or altered. These aren't far-fetched concerns. They're real risks that come with mixing a private investigation into an active criminal case. Fifth, there's the relationship with law enforcement. LAPD is not going to be happy if they find out a landlord has hired a PI to investigate the same case they're working on. It signals a lack of trust, which is one thing, but more importantly, it creates operational headaches. Detectives might have to spend time tracking down what the PI has been doing, who they've talked to, and whether their activities have compromised any aspect of the case. It duplicates the effort. So we could also say maybe the delay is related to the stuff that he's doing that now the LAPD has to follow up behind. If LAPD perceives the PI as a hindrance rather than a help, that could sour any future cooperation. The landlord might think they're being proactive and protecting their interests, but from law enforcement perspective, they're introducing chaos into a carefully controlled process. And finally, there's the question of motive and perception. Why is the landlord hiring a PI in the middle of an active homicide investigation? If their concern is purely about property damage or lease violations, there are other avenues to explore: civil attorneys, insurance claims, lease enforcement mechanisms. Hiring a PI suggests they're trying to conduct their own investigation into the homicide or the circumstances surrounding it. You know, we have one side saying it was a party house, one side saying it's not. You know, it becomes extremely confusing. And my thing is, I don't think this house is where the incident occurred, in my opinion. I think they just needed stuff to verify. You know, maybe some follow-up. Maybe that's why they sped through it, whether it was something targeted or just to deduce it and say we went through it so it could not be called out later on as not doing enough due diligence. But I think they know exactly what happened, and they're just waiting. They're just waiting because he was cooperative. He was a witness. And maybe he's can't talk because he's held to that, because it's an active investigation. That could be another thing. You know, outside the lawyer trying to protect him, it could be he is very cooperative and now he can't talk. That's why he can't mention anything that can open up the door to a possibility of what they're looking at. They do not want to compromise anything in this investigation, because if they do, Celeste has no justice. And as much as people may want to attack LAPD at this point, I would look right here: creative narratives and someone just poking themselves into an investigation that's already being looked at. And they already mentioned we need time. We got to wait for the autopsy results to come back. Why don't we know anything? We said it already. We need time. We got to wait for the autopsy to come back. And it takes time. Even though public has pressured for an answer, there's still people that are waiting for closure too, that, you know, they have to go through it. It could take time. You know, pressure may not always be able to push someone to the front of the list. And also, we don't really truly understand how decomposed that body was and how difficult it may be, and how they don't just got to check, but they got to cross their T's and dot their I's and do all these other things. So that raises uncomfortable questions. Are they trying to protect someone? This goes back to the PI involvement. Are they trying to distance themselves from liability? Are they worried about their own potential exposure? Or are they simply frustrated and trying to exert control over a situation where they have none? Whatever the motive, the optics aren't great. And if this case ends up in court, whether criminal court for the homicide or civil court for lease disputes or liability issues, the decision to hire a PI at this stage will absolutely come up. Attorneys will ask, what were you trying to accomplish? What did the PI find? Who did they talk to? And even every answer will be scrutinized. So here's the practical reality. Here's the bottom line. All right. There's a little bit left here, guys. So hold on. Here's the bottom line. Hiring a private investigator during an active homicide investigation is a high-risk move with very little upside for the landlord. They won't get access to the warrant or the receipt. They won't get answers from LAPD. They won't be able to compel witnesses to talk or documents to be released. What they will do is potentially interfere with the investigation, expose themselves to legal liability, and create complications that could haunt them later. If the landlord has legitimate concerns about their property, they should talk to an attorney, a civil attorney, who specializes in landlord-tenant law or property damage claims. That attorney can advise them on their rights, help them navigate insurance issues, and guide them through any lease enforcement steps if that becomes necessary. But sending a PI in the middle of a homicide investigation, that's not protecting their interest, that's inviting trouble. So here's the intersection of property law and criminal procedure. This is where two areas of law collide in a way most people don't expect, and the addition of a private investigator only makes the collision more volatile. In property law, the landlord owns the home. They can sell it, refinance it, make decisions about its long-term use, but during the term of a lease, they give up a significant chunk of control. They can't enter without notice. They can't let someone else in without permission. The tenant has possessory rights of possession. And those rights include the legal expectation that the space is private. In criminal procedures, law enforcement must respect that privacy. When they execute a search warrant, they're intruding on someone's Fourth Amendment protection. The law requires them to document that intrusion, to leave a paper trail, but that documentation is directed at the person whose rights were affected, the tenant, not the person who holds the title to the property. So even though the landlord owns the house, they're legally on the outside of the process. Their ownership doesn't grant them access to investigative materials. It doesn't give them standing to demand information. It doesn't put them in the loop. And when they try to force their way into the loop by hitting a private investigator, they're not just butting up against the boundaries of criminal procedure, they're potentially crossing them. That's when a landlord's understandable frustration can turn to serious legal problems. So what the landlord might eventually learn here, if this case goes to trial, if there are public hearings, if evidence is introduced in open court, then yes, some of this information might become accessible. Court filings can be public. Testimony can be reported. The defense might challenge the warrant, and those legal arguments could create a record. But that's all downstream. That's later. Right now, in the middle of an active investigation, the landlord is simply not a party to what's happening. They might have concerns about their property. They might have questions about the lease. They might want to know if they need to worry about liability or future legal issues, but none of that entitles them to the warrant receipt of the evidence log. If they're worried about damage to the property, they might be able to file a claim. If they want to terminate the lease based on criminal activity, which I think they did terminate, they need to review their lease terms and possibly consult an attorney. But accessing the investigative file, that's not happening, not now. And hiring a PI to try to make it happen, that's not a solution. That's a complication that could ripple through this case in ways the landlord never intended. So here's the bigger picture. And this is the closure. This isn't unique to the Celeste Rivas Hernandez case. This is how it works in every rental situation where law enforcement executes a search warrant. The tenant gets the paperwork, the landlord doesn't. And if the investigation is ongoing, nobody outside the case gets much of anything. It's a system designed to protect privacy, even when that privacy belongs to someone who's just renting. Because in the eyes of the law, your home is your home, whether you own it or lease it. And when the government intrudes on that space, the documentation of that intrusion belongs to you, not your landlord, not the public, you. So when people ask why the homeowner in this case didn't get the receipt, why they weren't notified, why they weren't being kept, why they're being kept in the dark, the answer is simple. They're not the ones whose space was searched. They're not the ones whose privacy was invaded. And under the law, that means they're not the ones entitled to know. And when the landlord tries to work around that by hiring a private investigator, they're not asserting their rights because they don't have rights to assert in this context. They're complicating an already complex situation. They're potentially interfering with a homicide investigation. They're exposing themselves to legal risk, and they're unlikely to get the answers they're looking for anyway. The law is clear. The tenant holds the privacy interest. The tenant gets the receipt, and the landlord, no matter how understandable their concerns, no matter how much money they've invested in that property, is on the outside looking in. It's not a bug in the system. That's the system working exactly as it's designed to work. So I wanted to put that out there, guys, just for clarity. I know it comes off as an attack, but it's just passionate. Because if this all comes out later on, and there's no justice, everybody will be blaming, and nobody's going to take onus. No one's going to take a level of responsibility. At the end of the day, okay, this side wants to create a narrative. This guy wants to put himself in investigations, and the landlord, wants to hire somebody. Let LAPD do what they got to do. We know what they're waiting for. I think they know more. and they just can't release it yet. And everything we're doing, it's like, oh, this guy's putting things together. It's already been put together. It's just not ready for release. But it's already been put together. And to say you're working on the property, but getting involved in the investigation, things that don't even relate to the property. I don't want this to fall through the cracks because somewhere along the line, the defense finds some excuse that later becomes a justification because we had too many hands in the pot, because people wanted to know and they couldn't wait. You know, sometimes justice takes time. And on top of time, especially on top of time, you need trust. And sometimes you have to give that trust blindly. But at the end of the day, I am going to trust into the lead authority of this. I don't have a reason to doubt anything that they're doing. And I'm not going to sit there and get confused by some BS narrative and somebody who's putting themselves right in the middle of an investigation as a PI. Because if I was a law enforcement professional and this was my case, I would be very upset. And not because I have something to hide, but I'm trying my best to secure what I need to secure in a process that cannot be challenged. And you're just opening up the door to so many different things. And as I said, the reason why it's probably taken so long is because they're trying to exhaust every effort that has been open because of the release of information that wasn't ready to be released. Sometimes they release information in a timely manner when it's ready because all avenues that could go elsewhere, we've securely closed. But when you release it too soon, all those doors are still open, and now you got to check every door and close them manually. It just adds and adds and adds. And then we're sitting there like, oh, why are they waiting so long? You should look inwards on that a little bit and see. I say wait. Wait patiently for the autopsy result to come in. Wait. And then maybe we got a reason to start pushing forward. But don't let this moment of ambiguity cause more confusion by people coming in and taking advantage of it. We want justice for Celeste. We want that. All of us here want that for so many reasons. For so many reasons. A life not lived. A life not lived. And it would suck if justice is sacrificed on technicalities that have selfish motivations. As always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. Stay safe.